30 to 50% of the Aborigine children were killed. Infanticide, 30 to 50%.
So this idea of extremely high rates of infanticide among Indigenous people is one of the more common myths. It's been around since the colonial days and it still persists today among people who want to believe it's true really bad. Now, infanticide did occur, as it has always in all cultures, but it was very much out of the ordinary. Annette Hamilton, for example, concluded back in the 80s that there was nothing but contradiction to the idea that infanticide was common. She said that most of the claims stemmed from hearsay and rumors spread among settlers. And indeed, the sources we have almost never recount actually having witnessed infanticide. They're all hearsay, rumor, or conjecture. Often, they're just plain ridiculous, such as one person who assumed, without ever having seen it, that Aboriginal people ate all of their newborn babies. Not some, but all. It sounds a bit like Stefan Molyneux's logic, really. Obviously, if it was anything resembling 30 to 40%, it wouldn't be so hard to find sources that directly witnessed it. The source of this myth has actually been traced. The idea that so-called savages practiced infanticide was common among the British, and it long predated the colonisation of Australia. So settlers projected this idea onto Indigenous people because it was simply what they expected, what we now call a stereotype. For example, in the 1830s, the British Select Committee into the Treatment of Aborigines in the Colonies investigated claims of Indigenous infanticide because they expected them to be true. But even though they tried very hard to find any proof, the only case they found was, wait for it, that of a white man killing an illegitimate baby he had fathered with an Indigenous woman. These dubious rumours were also used to justify the abduction of Aboriginal children, so the settlers had an incentive to lie as well. All in all, Margarita Stevens concludes in her study on Aboriginal infanticide that the idea that it was customary or prevalent is not supported by the balance of evidence.
They pound their bellies with rocks.
Contemporary estimates of abortion rates in the 19th century United States are above 20%. So, once again, he's trying to present something that's also common in the West as a uniquely bad thing specific to Aboriginal people.
Because, this stolen generations, is that the phrase? Right there, yeah. Right, so what is it, 6% of the kids were taken out, and it was under the same rules as they would be taken out of white families because of abuse and neglect and sexual abuse in particular. So 6% of children were taken out of highly abusive environments, and you never hear the end of it. The same things happen in Canada, by the way.
Well, there it is. We've reached the biggest denialist talking point. So for my non-Australian viewers, first I need to give you a bit of a background. It was common up until the 1970s for the authorities to confiscate Aboriginal children from their families and either adopt them out to white families or raise them in missions. About 1 in 10 children were stolen in this way, possibly a lot more. In the 90s, an investigation into this was finally commissioned, and it released its final report, called the Bringing Them Home Report, in 1997. This report finally revealed the full extent of what had really happened to broader society for the first time, and had a profound effect on Australian society, politics, and culture. It prompted official apologies by every single state and territory government, and the federal government finally apologised in 2008. Now, to respond to the Philosopher King, it was not for the same reasons as white people's children were taken away, nor were they subject to the same rules, nor was it for the protection of the children. There were many laws that specifically applied to Indigenous children. Here's just a few examples. In Western Australia, the Aborigines Act of 1905 made the state the guardian of any Aboriginal child under the age of 16, and this was later raised to 21. Yes, that's right. Aboriginal people had no legal parental rights. This remained in force until 1963. There was an almost identical law in South Australia under the Aborigines Act of 1911. In Victoria, the Aborigines Protection Amending Act 1915 gave the state the power to confiscate Aboriginal children without having to prove neglect before a court. I wonder why that might be. Now that's just a taste of it. There were plenty of other pieces of legislation that either applied specifically to, or were specifically directed at, Indigenous people, and especially their children. So, obviously, Stefan is wrong. The rules weren't at all the same as those that applied to white people. So, Why did they want these specific rules for Indigenous people? Well, they were nice enough to tell us that themselves. Lord Octavius Neville was the Chief Protector of Aborigines in Western Australia. This was the highest authority in the state in regards to Aboriginal people. He said in 1937, "Are we going to have a population of 1 million blacks in the Commonwealth, or are we going to merge them into our white community and eventually forget that there were ever any Aborigines in Australia?" His counterpart in South Australia said, "Children should be committed to state care, where they will be educated and trained to useful trades and occupations, and prevented from acquiring the habits and customs of the Aborigines." And from Cecil Cook, the Chief Protector in the Northern Territory, generally, by the 5th and invariably by the 6th generation, all native characteristics of the Australian Aborigine are eradicated. The problem of our half-castes will quickly be eliminated by the complete disappearance of the black race, and the swift submergence of their progeny in the white. The Australian native is the most easily assimilated race on Earth, physically and mentally. So this sums up the goal of the Stolen Generations: biological absorption into the white population. Take the children from their parents, deprive them of their culture, ban them from associating with their people, encourage them to marry a white spouse, and continue this for generations until there's no visible vestiges of Aboriginal culture or blackness remaining. And look, they even made us this nifty diagram to demonstrate their goal for us. This is clearly genocide according to the definition presented in the UN Convention on Genocide, which Australia was, get this, the first country to sign. In the present convention, genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial or religious group, such as forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So all in all, saying that the Stolen Generations were just a case of protecting children from neglect requires that you ignore what the people who carried it out openly said about why they were doing it.
When I started looking into the Aborigine history, well, it's kind of controversial, as you may have heard, right? So starting in the 60s, there was this conflict between historians, the old school historians, the new, obviously leftist, maybe even plain Marxist historians.
So, according to the master of the argument here, if you stop whitewashing history and acknowledge the fact that things actually happened, you must be a Marxist, I suppose. Contrary to his assertion, though, the leading figure of this shift in Aboriginal historiography in the 60s was not a Marxist, it was a conservative, William Stanner. Stanner coined the term the Great Australian Silence to describe the way that academics of the time just ignored Aboriginal people and the atrocities committed against them when writing colonial histories. That's a slightly inconvenient fact, isn't it?
They have this wonderful thing, this leftist historians. What they do is they wait until everyone's dead, and then they slander the living crap out of them because they can't get sued, because they're dead. And so they began going back to the 1920s and talking about, and even further back and so on, and they were talking about how brutal and horrifying and horrible the occupation was. You all know the story of the genocide and this and the murder and blah, right?
This just in. Historical research is now slander. A pretty interesting take from a guy who considers himself a historian.
And it's a problematic case to make, for sure. There's one estimate, you probably heard of this, that in Queensland it was 10,000 Aborigines who were killed. And a professor, very good professor, started looking into the sources for all of these claims. And it was interesting what he found. He found that the estimate of 10,000 came from no records.
The professor he's talking about here is Keith Windschuttle. Windschuttle isn't a professor, nor has he ever been because he never received a PhD, so he's not actually qualified to hold a professorship. Nonetheless, Windschuttle is a right-wing historian whose entire shtick is to deny everything, and his work has been thoroughly debunked by other historians, including other conservative historians. And yes, a few times he did actually find some bad citations, but some poor citations does not prove that there weren't massacres or that there wasn't a genocide. And just as a side note, Windschuttle's own work has been scrutinized, and he has dozens upon dozens of terrible citations that do not even say what he says they do. He also routinely ignores anything that contradicts his narrative, so he's not exactly a reliable guy here. As far as massacres go, though, Professor Lyndall Lyon, who is a real professor, has an ongoing project to map the massacres of 6 or more people from 1788 to 1930. He's identified more than 200 massacres of Aboriginal people by settlers. Even if we say, for example, that half of these never happened, that would still be 100 massacres. So I think it's safe to say that a whole lot of massacres occurred. It's also reasonable to assume that more massacres happened that were covered up and that we just don't know about. I'll show you one of these that was only recently uncovered in a second.
But the estimate of 10,000 came from no records, of course, right? I mean, not only did the indigenous population as a whole not have a history of a written language, but they don't speak of the dead.
Okay, I really don't understand why Stefan seems to think that the only way that we could know about massacres is if Aboriginal people wrote about them, because we mainly know about them because the colonists wrote about them. How did he not think about this? But just because he mentioned that, we actually do have massacres that have been confirmed by forensic evidence based on Aboriginal oral histories. For example, the Sturt Creek Massacre. The only survivor of this massacre in 1922 told their people what had happened. This story was then passed down to the present day orally. In 2017, these Aboriginal people were able to lead archaeologists to the site of the massacre. Here, they found bone fragments with clear evidence that someone had burned them in an attempt to hide the bodies. So yes, it is actually possible to confirm massacres based off the testimonies of Aboriginal people.
I saw one, I think it was the River Massacre. The estimates are that between 1 and 1,000 Aborigines were killed. 1 and 1,000. How is that anything? I mean, how does anyone say that with a straight face?
The River Massacre? The River Massacre. Could you be a bit more specific? What's the name of this river? That would kind of help us to find what you're talking about. I did find what he was talking about though. It was the Forest River Massacre of 1926. But it's not historians who overestimated the death toll. What happened is one of the witnesses vastly overestimated it, saying that up to 300 were killed, not 1,000. But that number isn't given any credence by historians. Historians actually say that about a dozen were killed, which is the same number that a commission into the massacre came to. So what Stefan is doing here is attributing the unreliable testimony of a single witness to historians as a block. It's bizarre.
But smallpox and so on. Now, smallpox, this is a big thing, right? This is the big thing. The Europeans, they brought over the smallpox blankets and they infected and nonsense. There was no germ theory of disease in the 18th century, 17th century, 16th century. Germ theory of disease didn't come till much later. I mean, okay, people knew you cough on someone and it's bad, but there was no big germ theory. They didn't know. They didn't have a microscope. They couldn't see the germs. They didn't know.
I'm continually amazed here. The smallpox blanket thing has nothing to do with Australia. It's from the USA. But since you mention it, Captain Watkin Tench, who arrived in Australia with the First Fleet in 1788, notes in his journals that he brought smallpox-infected material with him in vials. So they quite clearly did not need germ theory. 1 year later, there was an outbreak of smallpox among the surrounding indigenous population, which coincidentally came at a very convenient time for the colony, as they were having a lot of trouble with the local indigenous people. Now, there's different theories as to what exactly caused this, and we have no way of knowing for sure. But we do know that the colonists intentionally brought smallpox with them, and they certainly could have spread it amongst the indigenous people if they wanted to. The outbreak was extremely convenient for them either way.
But you have historians, and I've read these quotes, and the historians say, well, either accidentally or on purpose, these illnesses made their way into the Aborigine population. Again, either accidentally or on purpose. Seems like a pretty important distinction. But what they do is they put that in so that then idiots down the road can just say, whites infected Aborigines on purpose. Like they just throw this stuff in like a vague qualifier, and then it becomes an absolute, and then it gets taught.
So remember earlier when Stefan just said, they killed all of their geniuses out of nowhere and based on nothing?
So the people who asked the uncomfortable questions in the Aborigine culture were probably killed.
Probably. That is some juicy hypocrisy. But there's a huge difference. Stefan is using probably to justify just making stuff up. The historians aren't. To explain this, historians often make arguments based off circumstantial evidence. You see, history is not a court of law. You don't have to prove things beyond reasonable doubt. As often, there's just insufficient sources to form definitive conclusions. So you try your best to fill in the blanks. But just because these arguments can't be certain, it doesn't follow that the opposite, in this case it was an accident,